We're thrilled to have Jan Leach and Jean Kelly with us today, who are the authors of the U.S. National Climate Change Roadmap, and to hear from them of their experience in designing and putting this together with a group of people, and the opportunity that we have now within the extension community for Canada, Mexico, the United States, as well as the larger GFROST networks on what comes next. What role might extension play in this? And we're excited to hear from them and to hear from you all. We'll roughly have a half an hour for slides and presentation from Jean and Jan, and then we'll go into conversation together. So please keep putting your questions over in the chat, or we'll be a small enough group that we'll be able to raise hands and questions and speak to everyone directly. So I will now turn it over. I'm going to introduce first Jan Leach to introduce herself, and then Jean Kelly, and then we'll kick off. All right, thank you. Jan, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Carrie. My name is Jan Leach, and I'm a professor at Colorado State University. I'm a plant pathologist by training, and I do a lot of rice bacterial plant interactions. I'll turn it over to Jean.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Jean Kelly. I'm a professor of pedology here at Colorado State University. I'm also the director of the Agricultural Experiment Station, and my research is on soil science and mostly soil degradation here in the US and globally. So I think that's enough for the introductions. And Carrie, would you like me to start?
Yes, please, Jean. That'd be great.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us. It's an honor to be here. And thank you for the opportunity to present this, what we refer to as the National Climate Change Roadmap. And it's a little bit different than a roadmap, so we'll go into some of the details of that. The real driving force behind it was that we needed the recognition that sound and transparent science was essential for creating climate change policy, but also the research that supports these policies. We know with sound scientific data, research, there's an enormous potential for scientists to better educate the public, and also the need to provide the necessary information for creating major policy in the area of climate change. So we'll refer to this as the National Climate Change Roadmap, but we'll present the framework this morning. As we know, we'll start off with highlighting some of the trends that occur around the planet in response to climate change. And as we see that, our world is constantly changing, and these are what we call the planetary vital signs. Sadly,
next slide.
We'll see. Oh, I'm sorry. Did they get to that? Should I say next slide? Would that be good to do that? Okay. Sorry about that. Anyway, these are the planetary vital signs, and I won't spend too much time on these, but these lay the groundwork for some of the challenges that we face as scientists. You can see greenhouse gas emissions, again, on steady increase. Surface temperatures of the Earth and in the oceans are increasing as well. We're losing mass of ice. We see more fires. We see more areas burned globally. So lots of things going on, particularly with regard to things like flooding, drought, and biological invasions. Some of the key aspects of this that we've discovered in the agricultural realm is the importance of other trace gases like methane and nitrous oxide, which are in many cases linked directly to agricultural production systems. Next slide, please. So what we're going to do today is we're going to lay out the methods, and I'll talk about this briefly before I turn it over to my colleague Jan Leach. We chose to use something called the horizon scan methodology, which is really a way of in a sense, doing a risk assessment. We used 60 experts from all over the country. We went through a process of selecting those based on input from national research directors. We provided this group of scientists with an overarching sort of goal, which was to sort of create and explore what we call scientific insights about climatic research over the last 10 years. The process was very open-ended. We wrote a proposal to NEFA, so we had a significant amount of resources to conduct this, what we called National Climate Change Working Group. It's really a visioning exercise, and really it's allowing us to design and also really prioritize the needs of science and the scientific approaches that we use. What you'll see from this exercise is that the group got together and early on had made the decision that the thematic areas that we were originally exploring were not sufficient. And we spend an enormous amount of time creating what we call these new 7 thematic areas, which are highly integrated. And you'll see some examples of those in a second. And then what's derived out of each of these themes are what we call scientific insights. And my colleague Jan Leach and myself, well, we're presenting what we call exemplar insights. And these are insights that we cobbled together from actually more than 60 scientists that were involved in this exercise. The hope is that this framework would be used by other groups, and it is being used by other groups to create and explore new insights. So, for example, Jan will be presenting this at a meeting of an international meeting with plant pathologists, and it was our hope that this is a living document and it could be used by multiple groups of scientists. But again, it's not dispositive by any stretch of the imagination. So we have the Scantron there if you want to get a copy of it and look through it. And Jan and I will be available for questions at the end of this presentation, but also down the road, if things come up when you're applying this, we'll be available to help out. The original goal was to create this quote unquote roadmap and then have an implementation plan. And USDA doesn't have an official plan for implementation, but we're working with other scientists to come up with different approaches and methods for creating what we call the implementation plan. So what I'll do now is I'll turn this over to my colleague Jan Leach, and she'll start going through some of the major themes and providing some exemplar examples of the insights that we saw in each of these major themes. Jan.
Thank you. If I can have the next slide, please. So as Jean said, we developed 7 different themes, and I'll start with theme 1, which is addressing the complexity of solving climate resilience in agriculture. And this theme argues that our science needs to fundamentally shift to systems-based innovations and approaches that address complex combinations of stresses and their ecological and socioeconomic consequences. If I can have the next slide, please. One of the insights under theme 1 encourages an understanding of the impacts of biotic and abiotic interaction dynamics and climate-driven pathogen and pest migration on agriculture and forest health. So improving animal and plant genetics to tolerate climate variables like high temperatures or increasing droughts is difficult enough for scientists. But we now know that the climate change imposed stresses exacerbate existing problems caused by pathogens, pests, and weeds. For example, for many crops, the severity of disease increases with increasing temperatures observed with climate change. Even worse, the climate-imposed stresses are negating our efforts to reduce the impacts of pathogens and stress. We've seen that some plants that breeders have worked for years to integrate tolerance for high temperatures, when put out in the fields, are actually very susceptible to pathogens. In other cases, disease resistance traits that have taken breeders years to introduce into plants are rendered ineffective at high temperatures. So with shifts in environmental climates, pathogens and pests are now invading new ecosystems at unprecedented rates. In this slide, you see the global emergence of new crop diseases over a 7-year time frame. In these new encounters, we're often seeing that the plants are more susceptible to these new pathogens. Why, we're not sure, but it's possibly because the plants and pathogens have not co-evolved, so the plants lack the needed immunity. An interesting case study that touches on this is black sigatoka disease of banana, which was introduced into Latin America and the Caribbean in the 1970s. The disease established well because of the conducive environmental conditions of that region. But what's worrisome is that a new modeling study predicts the risk of infection by the pathogen has increased by 44% since 1960 due to warmer climates and higher humidity, which are the consequences of climate shifts in those areas. So clearly we don't have the luxury of focusing on improving for one stress at a time anymore. We need to embrace this complexity, and our science needs to fundamentally shift to systems-based innovations and approaches that address complex combinations of stresses and their ecological and socioeconomic consequences. I can have the next slide, please. Participatory approaches are described in theme 2. And this has many benefits, this type of approach. And it's because the science is co-created with a circular flow of information so that the information that's created is already in the hands of those who will implement it. In addition, the unique requirements and preferences of diverse communities are embraced in these approaches. So the resulting climate-informed practices are not only technically sound, but they're culturally and socially appropriate. If I can have the next slide, please. If I can have the next slide, please. Thank you. So a few insights that were relevant to theme 2 they were emphasized is the development of holistic education and communication programs that incorporate advanced technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning. Also, the co-creation of these resources would ensure that agricultural and land management stakeholders, scientists, and policymakers are abreast of the latest scientific developments, that they understand each other's priorities, and ultimately that they better align their broader environmental goals. Participatory research is also an opportunity to actively involve and learn from historically underserved farmers, bringing them to the table and their unique requirements of their diverse communities. The roadmap embraces the foundational premise that community-wide participation is prerequisite for the development and adoption of climate-informed agricultural practices. If I can have the next slide, please. For climate mitigation and adaptation, agriculture must optimize productivity across diverse landscapes and socioeconomic contexts, while including strategies that enhance soil health, carbon sequestration, biodiversity, and ecosystem services. If I can have the next slide, please. Exemplar insights touched on types of ecosystem management research needed to inform mitigation and adaptation priorities. If I can have the next slide, please. I'm sorry, go back. Mine's going a little slower than yours. So the exemplar insights touched on types of ecosystem management research needed to inform mitigation and adaptation priorities. And these included understanding microbiome interactions with animals and plants and how these can provide synergistic benefits and how to harness that capacity. Also, addressing critical knowledge gaps in how to reduce methane emissions in animal agriculture. This includes going beyond the development of technical solutions to understanding socioeconomic trade-offs and producer incentives for adoption of solutions that decrease enteric and manure methane sources. Innovation methods to ensure and verify the long-lasting benefits of soil carbon accumulation was another idea. And these are going to be crucial to informing practices like carbon offset markets for the future. And we were reminded of a paper recently out of Berkeley where a comprehensive study showed that there were systemic problems with offset markets. And in fact, they've decided to focus on cutting direct emissions rather than relying on carbon markets for the future. I can have the next slide, please. So theme 4 addresses the many challenges facing management of our precious water resources in a changing climate. We know that groundwater resources are being severely depleted through irrigation. And the impact of this depletion on our reservoirs is shocking. Again, a recent study suggests that withdrawal of water from underground reservoirs has been so great that, among other things, it's changed the tilt of the Earth's axis. And the US bears a large part of the blame in this. If I can have the next slide, please. So insights under theme 4, it addressed the need to efficiently manage water resources and to do so with actions that are coordinated at many scales spanning individual fields to entire ecosystems and river basins. To meet these needs, water managers and farmers need to be empowered with predictive tools that are based on accurate, real-time data of water availability and usage. In addition, adaptive and sustainable water resource management must include a unified framework that focuses on equitable dissemination and that respects Indigenous rights. If I can have the next slide, please. In recent talks, the Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, has been promoting the recycling of agricultural wastes into fuels, and this is a practice that creates new income opportunities for our producers. Clean energy-based agriculture could also be an important adaptation to meet climate targets and supplement farm income. If I can have the next slide, please. One option is agrivoltaics, which is the integration of photovoltaic panels with agriculture. Agrivoltaics has the potential to enhance food production while generating energy simultaneously. To date, agrivoltaics has not been adapted very widely because of concerns that include compatibility with farming practices and also the unknown long-term impacts on soil health and land productivity. So we need to think about a future of agriculture and clean energy science that would prioritize scalable and integrated design approaches. And these need to consider, among other things, crop selection, livestock management practices, short and long-term ecosystem impacts, and adoption by producers and communities. I'll now turn this back over to Jean to cover the last few top themes.
Okay, so next slide, if you can get to theme 6. Great. So thank you, Jan. Theme 6 addresses the concept of regenerative sciences. And regenerative sciences are simply there to improve soil health, ecosystem function and structure, and enhance food security, and of course, agricultural sustainability. Next slide. So with regard to the use of the term regenerative ag and the concepts of regenerative ag, it really is about refining the practices that we use. And the roadmap, in fact, recommended a wide range of solutions that could be used, all sorts of tools in the agricultural toolbox from things like artificial intelligence, genomics, genome editing, and even nature-based solutions. And these practices should be included in a participatory approach with the incorporation of Indigenous communities. For the successful implementation, we need to understand that both the social and economic impacts of different agricultural pathways, such as conventional or what we refer to as climate-smart agricultural systems, need to be understood, and these impacts on farms and farm household and workers and communities need to be addressed. We also need to ensure that the strategies and policies provide equitable distribution of outcomes, including fair access and also participation of stakeholders. Next slide. We're going to finish up on theme 7. This is the last theme, and this was based on socioeconomic and policy research. The policy that is based on solid scientific evidence is essential for effective and efficient decision-making. Next slide. To highlight these areas under theme 7, we were looking at the concept or the challenges of quantifying climate mitigation, value of land, and management practices. And we know it's not a perfect science. To shape evidence-based policy, we need more accurate greenhouse gas accounting protocols, and this is throughout the scientific community. Consider the variable nature of the ecosystem responses, the context-based measurements we make, and the impermanence of carbon removals from natural systems. Secondly, addressing climate change equitably requires more of a nuanced understanding of the diverse experiences of different communities. We need to recognize varying degrees of risk and responsibility and acknowledge the high impact on communities of color and ensure their inclusion in the decision-making process. And then finally, recognizing the role of Indigenous peoples, respecting their knowledge systems, and fostering inclusive collaborations are crucial steps in addressing climate change. integrating traditional ecological knowledge into climate change policies promote not only trust, but equity in the pursuit of resilient and adaptive climatic solutions. So we're going to sort of transition now into our discussion area. And what we understand now and working with our colleagues from across the country is that we have this challenge now of taking the good intentions of what we did here and translate it into action. It's a pivotal moment for scientists, scientific community, educators, practitioners, funders, all participants in the process. We always say that future generations will judge us on the actions that we take today because we can really make a difference. We possess the ability to gain knowledge and the capability to drive change. And so let's move ahead with this. I'll move over to the last slide, really summarizing the work the team did. And this is just an acknowledgement slide. Again, the grant was to Colorado State University. We are thankful and grateful to the Department of Agriculture and NEFA in particular, and Kevin Gebhardt and his team for guiding us through the process, and the Colorado Agricultural Experiment Station. We'd also like to acknowledge the National Climate Change Working Group. These were members of the team that worked endless hours in getting this process together. My colleagues, Jan Leach, Courtney Schultz, Aaron Jackson, and of course, Amy Bibby. And then finally, our partners at the Meridian Institute, Carly Campana, Lisney Cope, Tanera George, Heather Lair, and Laura Rosado. You can see the QR code here for scanning to the report, and then also the citation. Please feel free to download and use as you wish. I'm going to finish up on a transition slide. As I pointed out earlier, Jan and I have been working with different groups, and as we all know, those of us that worked internationally, that the Sustainable Development Goals are kind of a framework that's been adopted widely globally. And so what we've done is we've gone through and looked in many cases and tried to work with other groups in adapting our roadmap or our framework and how they map against the Sustainable Development Goals. So I picked out a couple of examples with Sustainable Development Goal 13, which is climate action, 2, which is zero hunger, 15, life on land, 10 would be reduced inequalities, and of course, 17 was partnerships for the goals. So anyway, I'm going to sort of end the formal part of the presentation here, and I'll turn it over to the hosts of the meeting, and we'll handle some questions if that would be appropriate this time. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Jean and Jan. That was an excellent overview, and thank you for what you were able to bring through hard work and a lot of partnership into that. Can we move to our next slide? In terms of, before we start the conversation, just want to reiterate for those who would like to participate in another language or ask your question, you can do so on Wordly, and then it will automatically translate. Otherwise, we'll be working in English. So thanks for that. And we'll be monitoring the chat. You can we're a small enough group. Thanks for coming back online and being able to see folks and their cameras. If you'd like to either put your question in the chat or just raise your hand, this is the time to have our conversation. I'd like to ask one question of Jean and Jan before we get going in terms of, and to welcome, we have participants from Canada, Mexico, and the United States, the countries that make up the North American Agriculture Advisory Network. And we also have members from the GFROST community. We opened this up to a global conversation today because of the importance in what we have discussed earlier, that you've created a framework now. The United States has stepped into that space, but how do you see next steps taking place, and what role would the extension community then play in that, be it in one of our 3 North American countries or globally? So I'd like to kick off with that question and then go to everyone else. So Jean or Jan, would you like to handle sort of some next steps?
Jan, why don't you take this one?
Well, I think one thing that as we said at the outset, this is an outline. It's a framework. It's not meant to be cast in stone. It's meant to be built upon. And the insights that we provided are all just suggestions and just a beginning place. We think that the roadmap needs to be expanded. And so now it's released out into the communities, and different communities like Extension, or for example, as Jean mentioned, the plant health community are taking these up and applying adding their own insights and building on that. The implementation is going to be the hard part, and that's what we've charged the community with. How can this be implemented? It can't just be another report that sits on a shelf that somebody reads, or maybe reads
Right.
1 or 2 pages of, reads the executive summary. How are we going to implement this? And NIFA is working towards that now, and Jean can add more insights into that.
Yeah, so I thank you, Jan. And again, I think when you, if you have not read the report, when you read it, you'll see this sort of we create the process whereby we came up with the roadmap and also the insights. And I think what was interesting was that we came up with guiding principles that we thought had to be incorporated into these thematic areas, and we refer to those as the North Star. So, those were a collection of thoughts and from scientists from across the country, from diverse backgrounds. And then you'll see things like recipes and stuff in there. And those are things that we think need to be an essential part of a research agenda, but also an implementation plan. And I think that was the big challenge. The implementation plan became monstrous at some point. So we really sort of backed off and sort of held to ourselves in terms of what we call, and with the help of NEPA, we refer to this as climate change science. And so that incorporates research, education, engagement, and other aspects of it. So we tried to keep it, we were deliberately broad. And it was quite a process. But anyway, so people have written back to us after they've read it a couple of times. Some of it started sinking in, I guess. So anyway, which I don't know if that's good or bad, but that's what happens. So yeah.
It's great. Thank you. Okay, let's open it up for questions, because we've got a nice selection of folks that are here, people from the United States, Canada, and Mexico, as well as our sister networks within GFROST. So any questions you have for Jean or Jan, or how it relates to the work that you're doing when they talk about being able to modify this framework or to work with new insights, let's hear your thoughts, please, in the conversation. Who would like to go first? Or I'll pick on somebody.
You're a tough teacher.
Yeah. I know. Oh, thanks, Peter. Peter, please.
Good morning or afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Peter Dorhout, I'm the Vice President for Research at Iowa State University. Hello, Jean and Jan.
Hey, how are you? It's good to see you, Peter.
How are you, Peter?
Yeah.
Good to see you both. Long ago, in a galaxy far away, I was a faculty member at Colorado State and one of their colleagues.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing, and really appreciate this. I really hitting on some of the high points, and Carrie mentioned this as well. I think that particularly colleges and universities, when it comes to educating the future workforce in this space, really presents some challenges for us in academic settings, but I think very unique opportunities to affect change. So I appreciate the 7 things that you brought forward in this report, some of what you shared. I think from the role that colleges and universities can play in serving as those trusted partners through extension offices, I think is really critical, and an important model that I know doesn't exist all over the world, but may represent an opportunity for us to gather together and talk about how do we leverage this model and encourage folks on campuses around the world to use the campus and the student body and the faculty to serve as important demonstration partners in those educational opportunities, showing those end users, ultimately the producers, the farmers, the commodity groups, that there are solutions, and they can be net positive when it comes to the incomes of the folks that are involved, but I think it's going to take a long time, and really leveraging the trust that exists within extension offices here in the US, but building that or supporting that model around the world, I think represents a great opportunity.
Thank you.
So that really wasn't a question. It was more of a pontification, but nevertheless, thanks again for all that you do and for what you shared here. And Iowa State stands ready to be a partner in that.
That's great. Thank you. Anyone else? I see Carl. Please, Carl's joining us from Europe and the executive director of GFROS. Thanks for coming in. Yeah, we can't hear you. Sorry.
You're muted. Muted.
There we go.
Sorry. Good day, everybody, and thank you for the presentation, and thanks for having me here. One thing that we had just had the European Parliament elections on Sunday this week, and what we are seeing in Europe is that everybody was sort of agreeing that we need to do something to mitigate climate impact. But now all the easy solutions has been tackled, and now the tough ones needs to be made. One of them being the emission from the agricultural sector throughout Europe. And so a little bit what I might be missing, or maybe not in your paper, but what we are missing is the financial analysis on this, because that is really what the farmers are interested in.
Right.
So one thing is, what is the impact? What is the financial consequences for a farmer of continuing doing what they're doing? Because we know that the climate impact will come for many years, for decades, maybe even centuries, but their economy runs from month to month. So this sort of serving the global group and the global good and the SDGs is one thing, but how does that, so all the good ideas you have, unless it's translated into an economic analysis, farmers are not interested. Sorry to say.
No,
Thank
that's
you.
fine. Yeah, I mean, I think I'll start off. I guess I think if I think we see many of the same challenges here in terms of adoption of practices. We sort of the scientific community has a quote unquote toolbox of things that we know will reduce or lower emissions of greenhouse gases in different production systems, animal systems, plant systems, and water systems, and I think what's happening here, and some of the things that the group had thought about, was shifting to more of like in the US, we have programs now where we pay for practice. We're not necessarily trying to measure carbon. We know that's almost impossible. And in fact, it's a little disingenuous to think that we're going to reverse climate change by fixing enough carbon in agricultural systems. It just doesn't add up. But the practices are important for sustainability, sustaining food systems and livelihoods. And so we're shifting to more of a pay for practice sort of thing, rather than trying to measure down to the gigaton of the amount of carbon that a farmer can fix. That's one way. But we did not have, there were several things in this roadmap that didn't fall out. And the economic analysis got to be, it's pretty cumbersome, and would almost be like a whole nother aspect of this, where you could take the framework and you could dive in to the economic levers that are under each of these. But no, we have the same challenges. We have like 4% of our farmers are subscribing to the carbon programs. 4% in the U.S. I mean, so they're not trusting the scientific community, and I don't think we've done enough to really convince them that we know how to do this. Yeah, and that's both on the basic science and also the economic end of things as well. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to ask Adrienne Leger, would you like to your comment or your statement, please?
Yes, thank you very much. So I'm Jan Leach with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. So thanks a lot for this presentation. It's really interesting, and I guess I have two comments and a question. So we're developing currently a sustainable agriculture strategy. So our scope is a bit different, but looking at the document, it's very similar in terms of the landscape approaches, the integration of the different environmental issues, taking them together, because we don't want to create unintended consequences. So we're paying a lot of attention to what you're doing. I really like the explicit focus on socioeconomic and policy research, because I think that's maybe something I'm speaking on my, from my own perspective now, not on behalf of AFC necessarily, but, I think we have forgotten a bit that we're dealing with people. So we tend to think that we have an economic sector that we're supporting, and that these are economic units, but at the end these are people making decisions. And I would support Carl's point about the importance of the economic aspects. In the context of the Sustainable Agriculture Strategy, we have had close discussions and undergoing consultations with the sector. And what comes back from producers is that they can't be green if they are in the red.
Right.
And this is something that we're really taking seriously, trying to think about what it means for them in terms of economic considerations, but also what I would call changes to their routines. So those costs, those transaction costs of adaptation to those new practices, because and this is something I wanted to know a bit more about, potentially, like the value chain approaches, how you're considering them, because of course, most of the environmental impacts are on farm, but then what's the, so farms are the ones on the hook, even if in a value chain perspective, to implement most of those beneficial management practices and incur those costs and those changes. But then how do we help them, surmount those costs, both economic and in terms of routines? I wanted to point to the Living Labs. That's an initiative that we have in Canada that's really successful, but it's still more research and develop, so co-development of solutions to environmental problems on the farm. So pointing back to you mentioned the importance of demonstration and showing what works to farmers. So we're hoping that by co-developing those solutions with them on working landscapes, that we're able to help them find the right solutions, but also then demonstrate to neighboring farmers that those are functioning. So this is, we have currently a network of 14 sites across the country with more than 1,000 people, different stakeholders involved, so working quite nicely. And we're working with the LTAR, with the USDA, with LTAR in that, from that perspective. And then just a bit further, then I guess, coming back to Carrie's point about extension, of course, we don't have the same structure and system in Canada for extension services. So those vary a lot across provinces and territories. But that's definitely what we've heard loud and clear from our producer discussions. It's really the need for them to understand more what the environmental issues are, which ones they should focus on, but also having access to the right information in terms of what those practices are, what those practices mean for them in terms of implementation. And again, coming back to what are the economic implications of, we're trying to figure out if, first of all, we have the right training for the agrologists and the agronomists for them to be equipped to provide this information. And then that's, I guess, a Canadian situation, but then what kind of structure do we have the appropriate structure in place, I guess, to deliver those services? And who's the best place for doing that when there's so much need? Anyways, I'll stop now, but very interesting work. Thank you very much.
Jean or Jan, would you like to?
Can I just ask a question? What did you call this, the program where you're doing the participatory research?
It's called Living Lab.
Living Lab? Oh, that sounds very, and there's a website on that?
Yeah.
Yes, my colleague Paige just put the link in the chat.
Great.
Oh, great. Thank you. Yeah, that sounds very interesting.
The other thing, I think I think you're right. We all face the same challenges. I mean, I'm finding this, regardless of the borders. And I just share something. Jan and I were out with a bunch of students a couple of weeks ago, and we went to the most progressive farmers in Colorado to talk to them. And then we'd ask them, and then in front of the class, I'd say, okay, so where do you get your information from? And they say, well, I get it from Farmer B down the road. And I'm like, and so we have a big hurdle to cross. And I know that's here in Colorado and across our country, is that, we always say we move at the speed of trust, right? And they're just not trusting us right now. And so I think that's a kind of a big, big, big hurdle. And again, a lot of it is based on a farmer saying, look, I can't incorporate this because I won't be able to pay my bills or send my kids to college or feed my family. And it's almost like we really need, we struggle with, small farms, medium farms, large farms, and we know all the challenges with those. But there has to be a shift we need a seismic change in the way we're doing this. And I think one of the ways that we can do this is if we can get the scientific community to speak up more and effectively. And I think that would be helpful. And then I think that's why the implementation plan would be really critical for other people to hear this, not just a bunch of scientists and administrators. Let's get it out to, more to the community. Yeah.
I agree. And actually, Adriana and Paige, it'd be lovely. Maybe we have as one of our conversations in the future, we feature the living labs and understand a little bit more about across our group within the 3 countries, and possibly open it up for a global conversation as well, because that's how we can learn from each other. So thank you very much. And, or even as you put together the strategy that you're developing, when it's in a place that you'd like to share and have input from the NAAAN community and from the GFROST community, that'd be lovely. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We'll, yeah, I think it would indeed be very interesting.
Wonderful. Okay. I saw Abdul, I believe you had your hand up. Is there, sorry, I'm looking. Any other questions? Any other? I'm looking on the screen. I might call on Ben Grove in terms of being part of the program committee for NAAAN CONNECT, and also your work from Virginia Tech, and how you see some of the implementation in the United States or through the work of GAIN, if you'd like to add into that.
Sure, Carrie, I knew that was coming at some point, so you're furiously reading. No, I mean, I think it's great, and I appreciate the presenters and the conversation. I mean, one thing that came to mind to me initially is how this work connects to other ongoing NIFA priorities like the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities. So you outlined the challenge and a framework for looking at it, but if we look at the scale of investment right now, and that's top of mind for me because Virginia Tech received an $80 million grant, and it was, to someone's point earlier, you know, it's paying for practices. So we're paying farmers for practices, and we're doing that in 4 different states across the US. So I'm curious about connections there. Another thought that I had was, this is a great report, and there's some really accomplished people that are a part of the conversation today. But how is this information getting to the National Association of County Ag Agents and groups that are working on that trust gap with farmers? So we hosted an agriculture summit in Virginia a couple of months ago. It was led by our extension director and the director of our agriculture experiment station. We pulled in about 100 stakeholders to talk about kind of emerging issues in Virginia agriculture. And one thing that we heard loud and clear in the sessions that I facilitated was the value of trust that people still place in cooperative extension. So science-based, trusted, independent information, but also a general lack of the reach of extension, right? So part of our value is not just what's happening at Virginia Tech and Virginia State, but that we can access Iowa State and Colorado State and our peers throughout the system. And so if we're working on that trust gap, how are we educating county agents so that they can educate the producers that they work with? And then how are we showing responsible use of federal resources when there seem to be a lot of really potentially impactful, high-profile projects like this? How do they all fit together? So again, that's sort of a question, sort of a statement, but thank you, Carrie, for giving me the opportunity to share.
Thank you, Ben. Jean and Jan, do you have thoughts on that? And anyone else, Mike, others that I know are part of extension in other states and within other countries, how are we approaching that trust gap? And where this report will be disseminated and used at local levels.
Yeah. Well, Ben, we've had a similar experience with the Climate Smart Commodities program, and most of us are sort of either involved deeply like yourself or peripherally like other folks. And I think one of the things that we're finding is that in our region in the West, water was the big thing. It wasn't so much carbon. We were thinking we need to be able to manage for water. And so there were initial investments in instrumentation stuff that we'd be putting out to farmers. And it was remarkable how many were not adopting the technology, not really wanting to know what their water content was of the soil. And so I have thoughts about that, but it's just interesting that a simple thing like that, we're still not trusted, right, in terms of that. So the idea would be that if this does get some traction, that this will gain a little bit of trust with some communities, and then we will move in the right direction. But I agree with you completely. I think the problem we're having is even the Climate Smart Commodities program is getting enough extension input at this point, right? And we're just early in the game, but that's the big challenge for us, is to get people out there talking. But the farmers don't want to go into a county, an office, and not get an answer. They want an answer right away. That's it, period. Right? That's what we're hearing in Colorado. Yeah.
Others, yeah, Peter, please.
I'm gonna add in an additional comment, but ask Jean and and Jan about this. I was on a panel a while ago talking about extension in particular in this context of climate and workforce preparedness. And the panel comprised a set of university administrators, one of whom was the president of the College of the Menominee Nation in Wisconsin. And his point with respect to this aspect of the trust gap that Ben spoke to, particularly in the US and Canada, or Western Hemisphere, more broadly speaking, engaging the indigenous populations in these conversations, particularly early on with respect to known practices, lived experiences, historic approaches to land management, crops, etc. And this general regenerative ag practices umbrella, and he talked about how important that was to the students at the College of the Menominee Nation, and how there was an opportunity for us to do more engaging with indigenous communities and affecting practices through them educating us. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that in the context of developing in partnership solutions and building trust with communities by engaging them before you deliver the solution.
Yeah.
It's huge. Jean mentioned this class that we took the students out into different areas of the state, and we actually went down into the southwest corner of the state and talked to some of our indigenous farmers. They need to be integrated into this, but we have to be extremely careful about how this is done, because there's this lack of trust that we're going to come in and take their ideas and their practices that they've developed for centuries without attributing back to them the science that was behind it. Or there was actually a conversation with a farmer, and not a Native American, but another farmer who didn't really want to know about the microbiome of his soil, because he'd done all these practices to make his soil more healthy, but he didn't want to know what the microbiome content was, because he didn't think it would be useful information, and I think he was afraid it might show something bad. So we have to be so careful about how we approach those studies, but we have to do it. These indigenous practices, the water management that we observed in southwestern Colorado on the Native American lands was so fundamentally more advanced than what we do. It was so interesting to see, but we need to be very careful about how we take advantage of that information or use that information.
Yeah, and we've had similar things. I'll follow up with Jan, working with indigenous populations, and some of the things nothing's codified, right? Nothing's sort of published or written. It's all anecdotal, and there's storytelling and all of the ways that they communicate. And I see that being a huge chasm. I mean, somebody had proposed, well, let's just go down and interview them, and they don't have to do anything. We'll just put a microphone up, and they'll just talk to us. And they're like, no way, nobody's doing that, right? So it really is kind of, I think really sort of understanding the cultural chasms and sort of really be willing to step in and embrace that and understand that their methods or anybody else's methods are as valid, right, as the methods that are produced by Carnegie One and other institutions that do this kind of work, and making them compatible might be an interesting sort of project for people to see how compatible they are, and in a lot of ways how similar they are. So anyway, but that's a whole wide open. I mean, I see that as being a really, really I was talking about a seismic shift in the way we do things. That would be seismic if we could actually really do that. Yeah.
It's not unlike the U.S. scientists going into the developing world and talking about how we're going to solve their problems.
Right.
It's not unlike that at all. We need to take advantage of the knowledge that they have and integrate it, work together as partners, not as, I'm the teacher, you're the student.
Right.
Yeah.
I think there's still an element of that in our counties as well.
Yeah.
We're from the government, we're here to help. And so
That's
that need for trust, and also, looking at legacies of land grant universities. I mean, I think it's a really relevant conversation, certainly more pronounced in certain contexts, but one that we can't just assume that because there was trust that it still exists. So how do we grow it where it's in absence?
That's right on.
That's right. And actually, that's a great segue in. Oh, Beverly, thanks. I'd love to hear your thoughts, please.
My name is Beverly Coberly, and I'm with the Extension Foundation, and we're just a foundation that serves to help redistribute funds for national issues. And I'm here today because I think this climate issue and the things I had not heard a report yet, I wanted to hear more about the Colorado report. But what I want to just say has to do with another non-related issue, is we work a lot in immunization education. We got started with CDC during the pandemic. And so what we had to do to reach many different kind of populations across the country, we had to do pilots to find out how do they want to receive information, and how do we learn from that. And it was the interesting part of that is I come at the University of Missouri, spent many years in extension at the University of Missouri, and now I'm with the foundation. Is, as educators and academics, we're so focused on the research and what it means, we forget that maybe we ought to also learn how they want to receive information or to have that connection. I think it was one of your pieces was number 3 or 4, somewhere about participatory kind of thing, and starting with the people where we're at. So it's just some lessons we've learned, and I'm trying to figure out how we fit the foundation to help with all of this climate thing. I'm listening today, but as you're talking about that, we ran head on into that in immunization education.
Right.
Nobody, they didn't trust anybody, and they were all mad, and there was politics all over the place. So how do we really get there? And what we learned is we have to learn how the population can receive information and begin to move in that way. So then we did pilot projects. So just a suggestion for a strategy. That's all.
Oh, that's great. That's a great idea.
Thank you. I'd like to ask, I know we have some of our Mexican colleagues online, and Salvador, working with the Ministry of Agriculture in Mexico City, SADER. Are you here where you could go online in terms of, we heard from Canada and the work that they're doing and preparing and thinking through strategies. Is there something similar, or, working on this conversation of how do we share, how do we implement and think through this as a living document? Salvador, do you have thoughts on what you saw and heard from a Mexican standpoint, please?
Yes, thank you very much, Carrie, for organizing this very interesting workshop. And Jean and Jan for the presentations. They were excellent. It will be great if we could have access. I saw there in one of the slides, like a link, I assume, to download the document. And hopefully, Jean, you could also share your presentation.
I will. Great. Absolutely. I'll send it down to you guys.
Okay.
Well, and just so everyone knows, just to say again, we said at the beginning, but the slides are in Spanish and French, and now currently on our event page on Connect. So if you haven't gone in, they're all available, and we'll work to do that with all our conversations and seminars. So thanks, Salvador, please.
Yeah, well, what I wanted to share is that we went in Mexico through a very similar exercise last March to come up with some ideas for the incoming government that will take over on October, second day of or first day of October later this year. And well, our exercise was also very, very similar. We had about 50-something participants, and came up, I would say, we agreed totally that we need to do all this in the context of the food system. And I think some inputs that were very important for the workshop was basically the publications, the most important, I mean, there are many, on the analysis of the global food system during, I mean, under the UN framework. And then also the book by Joachim von Braun, formerly with IFPRI, and some of his colleagues on science and innovation of food systems. We came up also with 6 priorities and described them in a very, we didn't go, time was not sufficient to go in deep, but I think it will be an important input for the incoming administration.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much.
We have a summary. We didn't work hard on the publication. We had a summary in Spanish, and we could also share it if it is of interest. Yeah,
that'd be lovely. Yeah, we could put that up in the climate hub, or in the climate part of the Mexico hub as well, to share that. That'd be lovely. Thank you, Salvador. I know we're at time, and I just want to thank Jean and Jan for this excellent report and for coming in and sharing this with the GFROS global community as well as with the NAAAN. We are a new group in terms of coming together around this engagement platform. So if you haven't joined on NAAAN Connect, if you are from the United States, Mexico, or Canada, please come in and be a part of this. We will also open up global conversations as we have done today to make sure our GFROS colleagues and others who aren't in North America can participate. So thank you to Carl and others who joined today. Thanks to Maddie Padilla and to Rebecca Papara, who helped put this together, and our technical support. Please see in the chat there, we've got a survey posted. We want to hear from you as to future programming, ideas from your countries, ideas that we can share and link in together around the Extension Advisory space. And our issues, again, are biodefense and mitigation of natural disasters, climate change, and building the next generation of leaders in ag. So these are all important issues to us and to the work you're all doing. And we want to serve Connect as an opportunity to really elevate your work and to get more programs on like Jean and Jan. So thanks, you guys. And I hope we can have you back in the future too around maybe some next steps. I think, Jean, you've got some ideas with the National Science Foundation as well. So we can maybe have an extra program or another conversation on that. So with that, a big thanks to everybody. Thanks for coming in for this hour, and we'll do it again soon. Okay. Thank you. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.